So Labour has quietly U-turned on yet another policy. This one would allow asylum seekers, including those who arrived illegally, to claim British citizenship. Now, I say quietly, firstly, because that's how it's reported, but secondly, it's quite deliberate, because this wasn't something that was announced in a press conference or ministerial statements to Parliament or anything of that sort. It was quietly buried in new Home Office guidance documents. And it took the Daily Mail and other news outlets, I suppose, to actually expose what's going on. So let's go through what's changed, why it's changed, and what it actually means. But first of all, please do subscribe to the channel. I'll be very grateful to you for doing that. It helps to keep this channel growing. Now, there's a sort of meaningful legal backstory to all this, quietly buried in all the detail. It's not just a political row between politicians. So let's look at what the law used to say. So firstly, a bit of background. So the Illegal Migration Act, passed under the previous Conservative government, imposed what was effectively an absolute ban on anyone arriving in the UK illegally, and most relevantly by small boat arrivals, permanently barring them from ever applying for British citizenship. Not just delayed or making it harder, it was banned outright, regardless of how long they subsequently lived here and whether their asylum claim was eventually resolved or whatever. It was an outright ban. When Labour came to power after the 2024 election, they scrapped this act alongside the Rwanda removal scheme. Yvette Cooper, then as Home Secretary, with the musical chairs moving around, drew up new guidance and softened the wording somewhat. Instead of an absolute ban, the rules then said citizenship would normally be refused to those who'd crossed the border illegally by a dangerous route. That word normally there was essentially one of the key wording, because it was the difference between a hard rule and a presumption that can be rebutted, a rebuttable presumption, so they can get around something with certain details and arguments. Now, there's a legal challenge that forced the situation of where we are now. And that softening of the wording is exactly what created this opening for what's happening now in the first place. So two firms acting for 5 migrants whose citizenship applications were refused brought a judicial review, arguing that an absolute ban infringed their human rights, and an international treaty obligation would thus be broken along with their human rights. Now, let's go through just very briefly what a judicial review actually achieves here, because I think many people misunderstand a judicial review. Some people seem to think that it is, someone disagrees with a judgment, therefore they go to a judge and they might overturn it just because they disagree with it. That's not always quite the case. A judicial review doesn't create new law. It doesn't just overturn a judgment because someone doesn't like it. It examines essentially a decision, whether that decision was lawful, rational, and compatible with the existing legal obligations. So, for example, was it a reasonable and rational decision? Did it take into account those things that it should not have considered, or did it not consider things that it should have considered? And all of these reasons might be brought through a judicial review. And this includes European Convention on Human Rights, which obviously is incorporated into UK law by our Human Rights Act. And if, therefore, a policy creates an absolute blanket bar with no individual assessment whatsoever, which is exactly the kind of policy that this was, then it is quite obviously vulnerable to challenge, which is precisely what I said in many of my videos. And I said that ECHR will be used in many different cases to argue, to challenge, to overturn, and ultimately change the rules. And this is what UK courts have repeatedly found now, that blanket bans with no mechanisms for exception are just not those that are conducive to human rights laws and other basic principles of proportionality and other administrative laws, certainly those with international conventions and so on. So faced with this challenge, the Home Office didn't fight it through to its judgment. It gave in, essentially, and as a result, the taxpayers ended up covering the legal costs for 4 of the 5 claimants, And British taxpayers have now paid the legal process that has resulted in a policy that makes it easier for illegal migrants to arrive and get citizenship. So there's an irony that's worth considering for a moment. So now let's look at what the guidance actually says now. So here's the substance of these quiet changes. New guidance signed off by the current Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, says that it will normally be appropriate to disregard overstaying, illegal entry or arrival without making required entry clearance or electronic travel authorization having made a dangerous journey where it was outside the person's control. So in English, that means if someone enters Britain illegally, including dangerous channel crossings, and they can show that the illegal manner of their arrival was, quote, outside their control, then the Home Office will generally overlook that illegality entirely when assessing a citizenship application. So now the examples given include the victims of trafficking. And now, to be fair, I think most reasonable people would agree that someone who was trafficked into the country against their will is a fundamentally different moral and legal situation and obligation than someone who has made a free voluntary choice to pay a smuggler thousands of pounds and cross the channel illegally, dangerously in a dinghy. Trafficking victims are quite rightly treated differently throughout the immigration and criminal system, and there's a whole system and separate statutory framework, including national referral mechanisms, built around exactly this distinction. But here's where the legal problem with the guidance actually sits. It explicitly says that the policy is not limited to such cases. And that's the key point. It isn't narrowing down just to protect trafficking victims. It is broad enough to potentially capture a wide range of different circumstances where someone might argue that the manner of their arrival was in some sense or another outside of their control, even when they made an active choice to travel either by a small boat or, for example, rather than applying for the asylum in a completely different lawful route. And so you've obviously heard on the news that they are now looking to open up legal routes and everything else. Some people agree, some people don't agree, and I think a lot of that is almost beside the point. I think the main point should be that the citizens of the UK should get some sort of choice in the matter. But the official response to that, I suppose, is that we vote in a government and the government decides the rules on what's going to happen. And then we get the complexities, which I've been talking about in my videos, whereby if we get a change in Prime Minister and ultimately a change in government and attitude and everything else, surely the public should get a say in that as well. Surely we should then have a new general election to choose both the leader and the party. But I don't think that's what's going to happen here. Now, the government's defence on all this and their response is that it is a minor change, which, given that it represents a complete reversal of an outright ban into a discretionary case-by-case assessment, I think that's a fairly generous description by themselves of what actually happened. And as I say, quietly, because they've obviously not made any sort of big announcements about it, because I don't think it will get positive attention in the press if they were to do so. And so this, I suggest, may be just one of many different policy changes that we see over the coming months and remainder of this parliament with the new incoming PM, whoever that might be. It looks like it's going to be Andy Burnham. And I still think that's a little bit strange, actually, that he just seemed to be plucked out of almost nowhere when he wasn't an MP. Then suddenly he's, someone's given up his seat for him, and then he's gone for the by-election, then he gets into Parliament, and then now you see these photographs on social media where he's standing in front of a whole group of Labour MPs as though he's like the chosen one, the golden one, what do they call him? King of the North? I find it all a little bit strange, but that's just, no criticism. I'm just making a comment. It seems strange. And to a lot of people, myself included, it just seems a bit of a strange situation. But I think we're going to see a lot of these policy changes, many of them quiet, and some of them we might have big announcements for as well. But watch this space. We'll see what happens. I will endeavour to tell you about it and discuss it. And we can all do that as we exercise our right to the freedom of expression, particularly when it comes to politics and how this country is being run. Let me know your thoughts and comments in the box below. And as always, thank you for watching.